By 9:30 on a wet September evening, the lamps along the high street of Little Ferron shone in blurred halos, and the rain had settled into that determined English drizzle which seemed less a weather than a state of mind. The village had been quieter than usual all day, as though the clouds themselves had pressed people indoors. Yet there was still enough life about the Crown tea rooms to give the place a warm and purposeful appearance. Inside, the final guests of the Parish Relief Committee had only just risen from their cups. There had been speeches, a modest raffle, and a rather earnest discussion about winter coal allowances. It had all been, in the opinion of most present, a very worthy success. Miss Marple, sitting a little apart near the window, had listened with her usual mild attention. She wore a soft grey shawl and held her tea-cup with an air of complete harmlessness that had deceived far cleverer people than those in Little Ferron. She had come down from St. Mary Mead for a fortnight's visit with her old friend Mrs. Bantry's cousin, who lived in a neat brick house beyond the church. The change of village had not altered the essential nature of village life, and Miss Marple had found that rather comforting. Human beings, after all, varied much less than they liked to think. At the far end of the room stood Sir Alistair Wren, who had given the evening a certain distinction by his presence. He was a handsome man of late middle age, with a careful voice and a diplomat's polished manner. Though officially retired, he had once held a post at the Foreign Office and, for the last few years, had lived at Ferron Hall with his widowed sister, Celia. His arrival in Little Ferron had brought to the village an enduring air of mystery and importance. People lowered their voices when they mentioned embassies, ministers, confidential cables, and receptions in distant capitals, though in truth nobody knew anything very precise. That, of course, made it all the more satisfying to discuss. Sir Alistair had just been thanking the vicar's wife for an admirable evening, when a young man entered from the street without removing his hat. He was dark-haired, pale from the rain, and carried himself with the taut, impatient energy of someone used to urgent business. The room fell at once into silence. Even in a village, one recognized an intrusion. "Sir Alistair," the young man said, and though his voice was low, it carried clearly, "I must speak to you at once." The diplomat's expression changed so slightly that only an experienced observer would have marked it. A shade of annoyance quickly masked, a sharper line about the mouth. He glanced around the room and smiled. "My dear fellow, this is hardly the place. It cannot wait." That, thought Miss Marple, was very badly done. Men who bring bad news or dangerous news into company often do not know how conspicuous they become. Sir Alistair moved toward him with polished reluctance. "Perhaps outside." "Biff!" "Fifth." There was the murmur of a brief exchange, the sound of the outer door opening and then closing again. When Sir Alistair returned, his composure was perfect, but he had forgotten his clubs on the mantelpiece and had to go back for them, which was a small thing, yet odd in a man celebrated for self-command. "I am afraid I must leave you," he said. "An unfortunate matter has arisen." Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, fluttered anxiously. "Nothing serious, I hope? Let us say merely inconvenient." He gave a little bow and was gone. Several people at once found reasons to stand near the window. "Who was that?" whispered Mabel Crewe, who kept the post office and considered it her duty to know everything before anyone else. "A foreigner, I should say," murmured Colonel Harbury. "Something in the face." "Nonsense," said Dr. Culwin. "He spoke like an Englishman." "Government business," said Mrs. Finch darkly, and enjoyed herself. Miss Marple set down her empty cup. "It is sometimes surprising," she said pleasantly, "how often what looks like government business turns out to be something much more private." Nobody paid much attention, which was generally the fate of her most valuable remarks. By 10 o'clock the party had broken up. Umbrellas bobbed along the high street. Lights went out one by one. Little Ferron began settling into its habitual sleep. Yet not everyone went directly home. In a village, curiosity is both vice and recreation, and the sight of an urgent messenger collecting Sir Alistair Wren on a rain-soaked night was not the sort of thing people surrendered easily. Mr. Pritchard, the chemist, who had locked his shop and was taking the lane behind the church to save time, later said that he saw a motor car standing near the old war memorial with its lamps off. He thought nothing of it then, except that it was imprudent in such weather. At almost the same moment, Agnes Lark, parlour-maid at Ferron Hall, looking from an upstairs window before bed, saw her employer crossing the lower garden with a lantern in one hand and no coat on, though it was a cold night. She also saw, or believed she saw, another figure waiting by the side gate where the path led toward the disused rectory wall. It was shortly after midnight that the shot was heard. In villages, a shot has a peculiar quality. It does not belong. It tears through the ordinary night in a way that cannot be mistaken, and in the seconds afterward there is always a silence heavier than the noise itself. Dogs barked. A child cried out somewhere. A bedroom candle flared in an upper window of the cottages opposite the green. Miss Marple, who had not yet gone to bed because damp weather was bad for her knitting wool, looked up at once. Her eyes, behind their mildness, were sharp. Within minutes, doors were opening all along the lane near Ferron Hall. Men came out half-dressed under coats. Women stood on thresholds with shawls clutched to their throats. Someone ran for Dr. Colwyn, someone else for the constable. The hall gates stood partly open, moving slightly in the rain. It was Dr. Colwyn who found the body, lying just beyond the yew hedge near the side gate. The lantern had fallen and gone out. Sir Alistair Wren was on his back, one arm crooked awkwardly under him, his face turned toward the black wet leaves. There was very little blood, which made it worse somehow. The neatness of violence was always more shocking than disorder. A little silver object glinted a few feet away in the mud. Dr. Colwyn bent instinctively toward it, then stopped himself and straightened. "What is it?" asked Colonel Harbury behind him. "Stand back," the doctor said. But Miss Marple, who had arrived more slowly and now stood beneath a dripping umbrella at the edge of the group, had already seen it, not the object itself, though that was curious enough, but the expression on Agnes Lark's frightened face as her gaze darted once toward the dead man and once toward the dark line of the rectory wall. It was not grief, nor even ordinary fear. It was the look of someone who has expected trouble, but not in that exact form. And that, Miss Marple thought, was where such matters usually began. The rain had not stopped by morning. It lingered in the hedges and along the stone walls like a dull grey curtain, and the whole of Little Ferron seemed to wake with a kind of uneasy reluctance. News of Sir Alistair Wren's death had spread before breakfast, carried from door to door with the quiet urgency peculiar to small villages. By 8 o'clock, nearly everyone knew the essential fact, though the details were already multiplying in ways that would have puzzled even those present during the night. At the post office, Mabel Crewe was speaking with great authority to a small circle gathered near the counter. Her voice dropped and rose in confident whispers. "A pistol, they say, quite close range, and in his own garden too. If you asked me, it must have been someone who knew the place well." Mrs. Dalton, who ran the bakery, leaned forward eagerly. But who would do such a thing? Sir Alistair was always so polite. "Polite," Mabel repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, though of course one never really knows about people who've lived abroad for so long. Foreign entanglements, that sort of thing." The suggestion was received with respectful nods. Foreign entanglements possessed an irresistible glamour when discussed over morning tea. Meanwhile, the police had begun their work at Ferron Hall with a quiet efficiency that seemed oddly restrained given the drama of the crime. Inspector Halliday, a tall man with thoughtful eyes and a habit of speaking only after a considerable pause, had arrived from the nearby market town shortly after dawn. He walked slowly around the narrow garden path near the side gate while a constable took notes beside him. The ground was soft with rain, yet the traces were not particularly helpful. There were many footprints, some overlapping, others blurred entirely by the wet earth. The lantern Sir Alistair had carried lay where it had fallen, now extinguished and streaked with mud. Inspector Halliday crouched briefly, studying the ground near the hedge. His attention shifted to a small silver object that had been placed carefully on a folded handkerchief by the doctor the night before. It was a cigarette case, plain, elegant, and clearly expensive. The initials engraved on the lid RM caught the light faintly through the grey morning. "Was this Sir Alistair's?" the inspector asked. The inspector asked. Dr. Colwyn shook his head. "I have seen him smoke on occasion, but he never used that case." The inspector closed it thoughtfully. Inside were 2 cigarettes, untouched. Not far away, Agnes Lark stood near the kitchen door with her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. She looked pale from a sleepless night, though her eyes moved constantly toward the garden as if hoping the dreadful scene might somehow vanish. Inspector Halliday approached her with quiet patience. "You were the one who saw Sir Alistair crossing the garden?" "Yes, sir," she said quickly. "Just before midnight. He had a lantern with him." "And you mentioned another person." Agnes hesitated. "It was only for a moment, yet it was long enough to be noticeable. I thought I saw someone, sir, by the gate. A man or a woman. I couldn't say exactly." The inspector regarded her steadily. "Height, shape, clothing." There was a coat, a dark one. It was raining so hard her voice trailed off and she looked down at her shoes. Inspector Halliday made a small note in his pocketbook. "Did Sir Alistair expect visitors that night?" "Not that I know of, sir." The inspector thanked her gently and turned away. Across the village green, speculation had already become a form of entertainment. Colonel Harbury had settled himself at a corner table in the Crown Inn, and was recounting his version of the night's events with considerable dramatic flair. "Clearly a political matter," he declared. "You don't serve in embassies across half of Europe without collecting enemies. Espionage, perhaps." "Espionage?" Mrs. Finch repeated with fascination. "Well, something of that nature," the colonel said vaguely, enjoying the effect. Miss Marple sat nearby with a small plate of toast and marmalade. She listened without appearing to do so, her knitting needles clicking quietly together. What struck her most was not the colonel's theory, which seemed rather theatrical, but the reactions of those around him. People revealed themselves far more clearly in conversation than they ever intended. For instance, young Richard Mellor had entered the inn only moments before, and now stood frozen near the doorway. The cigarette case found near Sir Alistair's body bore the initials R.M. Richard Mellor was the nephew of Lady Wren, Sir Alistair's sister, and had been staying at Farron Hall for several weeks. He was a tall young man with restless hands and a face that carried the faint strain of someone who had slept badly for several nights. When Colonel Harbury mentioned the word espionage, Richard's expression tightened in a way that seemed almost involuntary. Miss Marple noticed. She also noticed something else. When Mabel Crewe cheerfully announced that the police had discovered a silver cigarette case belonging to a mysterious visitor, Richard Mellor turned very pale indeed. He recovered himself almost instantly, but not before Miss Marple had seen the brief flash of alarm. "Such dreadful weather," she said gently into the silence that followed. "Rain can be very inconvenient when something unpleasant happens outdoors. It tends to blur things one might otherwise see quite clearly." Richard forced a polite smile. "Yes, quite. But he left the inn almost immediately afterward." Miss Marple watched him go with mild interest. A few minutes later, Inspector Halliday entered the room, removing his hat and shaking off the rain. His eyes moved quickly over the gathered faces before resting briefly on Miss Marple, whom he recognized from an earlier introduction that morning. "You were present last night, I believe," he said courteously. "Yes," she replied. "I wonder if you noticed anything unusual." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Well," she said at last, "there was the young man who arrived during the tea gathering. The one who insisted on speaking with Sir Alistair at once." "Yes," said the inspector quietly. "We are very interested in that gentleman." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought you might be." She resumed her knitting, her expression as gentle as ever. Yet behind the calm rhythm of the needles a small pattern had already begun forming in her mind, one composed not of footprints or pistol shots, but of human behavior. And human behavior, she knew very well, rarely lied for long. The rain had lifted by late afternoon, leaving the village washed clean but subdued, as though the earth itself had paused to consider what had happened during the night. The hedges glittered with drops of water, and the clouds drifted slowly apart to reveal a pale strip of sky above the church tower. Yet the calmness of the day did little to quiet the undercurrent running through Little Farron. People spoke more softly, lingered longer in doorways, and watched one another with the cautious curiosity that always follows a violent event. Inspector Halliday had spent most of the morning at Farron Hall. The house itself, a long, dignified Georgian structure overlooking the lower field, seemed strangely hollow now. Lady Celia Wren received the inspector in the morning room with the composed politeness of someone who had lived long enough among diplomats to regard emotion as something to be handled carefully. She was a tall woman with silver hair arranged impeccably, though the faint shadows beneath her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "My brother kept very regular habits," she said calmly. "He disliked surprises." "And yet he left the house close to midnight," the inspector replied. "Yes, that is unusual." "Did he mention expecting anyone?" "No." Her answer came quickly but not nervously. If anything, it was almost too controlled. Inspector Halliday waited a moment before speaking again. "Did your nephew, Mr. Richard Mellor, spend the evening here?" Lady Celia's gaze shifted slightly toward the window. "He returned rather late from the village," she said. "I believe he had been at the Crown. Did he leave the house again afterward?" "I cannot say." The inspector thanked her politely, though he wrote several quiet notes in his pocketbook before leaving the room. Outside, the garden had begun to dry, but the marks from the previous night still lingered faintly in the soil near the side gate. The constable had roped off the area, and villagers occasionally paused beyond the hedge, whispering as they peered through the branches. Miss Marple stood among them for a short while, holding her umbrella, though the rain had stopped. She did not appear particularly interested in the garden itself. Instead, she watched the faces of the people gathered nearby. It was remarkable, she thought, how quickly a tragedy rearranged a village's social patterns. Some people grew louder, eager to demonstrate their knowledge. Others retreated into silence, and occasionally someone betrayed a discomfort that had nothing to do with grief. Richard Mellor appeared again shortly after 3 o'clock. He came down the path from the house with hurried steps and stopped abruptly when he noticed the small group near the hedge. His eyes moved quickly from one face to another. Miss Marple saw the moment when he realized she was there. His expression flickered with something very close to unease. "Good afternoon," she said gently. He nodded. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" "Yes, indeed. I understand you were present last night." "I was." There was a pause, the sort that often reveals more than conversation. Richard cleared his throat. "A terrible business." "Very sad," Miss Marple agreed. Her knitting rested quietly in her lap as she regarded him with mild curiosity. "You must have been very fond of your uncle." "Yes, of course." His reply came a little too quickly. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Families are such complicated things, don't you think? Even when affection is perfectly genuine, there can be misunderstandings." Richard's hands tightened briefly in his coat pockets. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." "Oh, nothing in particular," she said lightly. "Only that I have often noticed how easily small difficulties grow larger when people are under strain." He forced a thin smile. "Well, there has been a great deal of strain lately." "Indeed?" "Financial matters," he said abruptly, then seemed to regret speaking at all. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, money troubles can be very wearing." Richard glanced toward the garden gate where the murder had taken place. His eyes lingered there only a second before shifting away. "I must go back to the house," he said. "Of course." He walked away quickly, his shoulders stiff. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. It was not long before Inspector Halliday joined her by the hedge. He had noticed her earlier, but had waited until the crowd dispersed before approaching. "You seem to observe people very closely," he remarked. "My dear Inspector," she said pleasantly, "in villages that is practically a necessity." He smiled faintly. "You spoke with Mr. Mellor just now." "Yes." "And," Miss Marple paused, considering how best to phrase her thoughts. "I think," she said slowly, "that he is a young man who has recently received some very unpleasant news. Financial news, perhaps. That seems likely." Inspector Halliday glanced toward the hall. His uncle controlled most of the family money. Miss Marple nodded gently, which makes the situation rather awkward. The inspector watched the garden again. Awkward enough for murder. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down the path toward the old rectory wall, where ivy hung thickly over the stones. "It is curious," she said at last, "how often people assume the most obvious explanation must be correct." "And you disagree?" "Not entirely," she replied, "but there is something that troubles me." "What is that?" "The young man who came to the tea gathering last night. Inspector Halliday's attention sharpened. "We have not yet identified him." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over her knitting. "He looks like a messenger," she said thoughtfully. "Someone accustomed to carrying information rather urgently." "Information about what?" Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the quiet garden. "That," she said softly, "is the interesting question." By the following morning, the clouds had cleared entirely, leaving the village beneath a bright autumn sky that seemed almost indecently cheerful given the circumstances. Sunlight fell across the hedges and rooftops of Little Ferrin with calm indifference, while the ordinary routines of life began cautiously to reassert themselves. Shops reopened, milk carts rattled down the lane, and children on their way to school paused in excited groups to whisper about the shot heard in the night. Yet beneath that fragile return to normality, the murder of Sir Alistair Wren remained the single subject on every mind. At the Crown Inn, where villagers had begun gathering again with renewed purpose, the conversation had taken on a slightly sharper edge. Colonel Harbury was speaking with great conviction, his voice carrying across the room. "I tell you it must involve foreign affairs," he said. "Embassy work doesn't simply disappear after retirement. There are always unfinished matters." Dr. Colwyn shook his head thoughtfully. "Possibly, but the pistol used was quite ordinary. Nothing particularly professional about it." "That proves nothing," the colonel insisted. Miss Marple sat quietly near the window with her knitting once again, listening with the same gentle interest she always displayed. It had been her habit for many years to let people talk themselves into revealing what they believed most strongly. It saved a great deal of trouble. Across the room, Mabel Crewe leaned forward eagerly. "I heard this morning," she announced, "that the police believe the cigarette case belongs to Mr. Richard Miller." The statement created an immediate stir. "Are you certain?" asked Mrs. Dalton. "Quite certain," Mabel said, though the certainty was based almost entirely on her imagination. At that moment the door opened and Inspector Halliday stepped inside. Conversation stopped at once. He removed his hat slowly and approached the bar before turning to address the room with quiet authority. "I should like to clarify something," he said. "The cigarette case found near Sir Alistair Wren has not yet been confirmed as belonging to anyone in the village." A faint ripple of disappointment passed through the listeners. "But," he continued, "we have discovered something else of interest." That was enough to bring the room into complete silence. "Sir Alistair received a letter yesterday afternoon," the inspector said. "It was delivered shortly before the relief committee gathering." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused very briefly. "What sort of letter?" asked Colonel Harbury. "A request for a meeting." "From whom?" "That," said Inspector Halliday calmly, "is precisely what we are attempting to determine." The inspector left soon afterward, but his announcement had already produced a new wave of speculation. People leaned closer together, exchanging theories with great enthusiasm. Miss Marple finished her tea and quietly rose to leave. The afternoon sun had warmed the village green, and the air carried that faint earthy smell that follows rain. As she walked along the narrow lane toward Ferrin Hall, she noticed someone standing near the old stone wall that bordered the abandoned rectory garden. It was Agnes Lark. The parlour-maid looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. She seemed relieved when Miss Marple approached. "Oh, Miss Marple, I was hoping to see you." "Were you, my dear?" Agnes nodded quickly. "I didn't like to say anything before the inspector, but there's something I remembered." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "Yes?" "The man by the gate last night. You said you weren't sure who it was." "I wasn't," Agnes said. "But I remembered something about his voice." "His voice?" "Yes. When Sir Alistair reached the gate they spoke very quietly, but I heard just a few words." Miss Marple waited patiently. Agnes lowered her voice. The man said, "You know why I'm here." Miss Marple considered that. "And your master?" He said, "Not here." Agnes swallowed nervously. Then they moved closer to the wall. I couldn't see them anymore. Miss Marple looked toward the ivy-covered stones beside the path. Did they sound angry? No, not exactly, but there was something strange about it, like they both already knew what the other was going to say. "That is very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. Agnes hesitated again. "There's one more thing." "Yes?" The man didn't sound like a stranger. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Agnes glanced toward Ferron Hall before answering. I think I've heard that voice before." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Her gaze rested thoughtfully on the quiet lane. "Memory can be a curious thing," she said gently. "Sometimes it reveals itself only when we stop trying to force it." Agnes nodded uncertainly. "I keep thinking about it. You may recall it suddenly," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps when you least expect it." They parted soon afterward, Agnes returning toward the house while Miss Marple continued slowly along the lane. As she passed the rectory wall again, she paused. The ivy was thick there, hanging in dark green strands over the weathered stones. A narrow strip of damp earth ran along the base of the wall, where two people might easily stand hidden from the house windows. Miss Marple studied the ground with mild curiosity. There was nothing obvious now. The rain had erased nearly everything, yet the position itself seemed meaningful. If two men had wished to speak privately while avoiding observation from the house, the wall would provide the perfect shelter. Miss Marple resumed walking. What interested her most was not the meeting itself, but the nature of the conversation Agnes had overheard. "You know why I'm here." "Not here." Those were not the words of strangers. They were the words of people who already shared a secret. And in Miss Marple's long experience of human nature, shared secrets were very often the most dangerous things in the world. The following day dawned clear and quiet, the sort of calm autumn morning that seemed almost deliberately peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the thinning leaves along the village lane, and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Yet the calm did little to settle the unease that had settled over little Ferron since Sir Alister Wren's death. If anything, the stillness only made the tension more noticeable. Miss Marple had taken her usual seat near the window of the Crown Tea Rooms shortly after 11. A small pot of tea rested beside her knitting, though she had not yet poured a cup. Her attention drifted instead toward the street outside, where people moved about their errands with a curious mixture of caution and excitement. Mabel Crewe appeared moments later, clearly eager to share something important. "Miss Marple, have you heard the latest?" "I rarely hear anything first," Miss Marple replied gently, "but I am always interested afterward." Mabel lowered herself into the chair opposite with theatrical seriousness. "The inspector has discovered that Sir Alister's letter came from London." "That seems reasonable," Miss Marple said. "Yes, but the interesting part is that it wasn't posted in London at all." "Oh?" "It was delivered by hand." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly over her knitting. "That does sound rather deliberate." "Exactly," Mabel said triumphantly. "Someone wanted to make certain Sir Alister received it personally." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did the letter say when this meeting was to take place?" "Apparently midnight," Mabel whispered. Miss Marple looked out the window again. Midnight meetings, she reflected, rarely occurred without good reason. At that moment the door opened and Richard Mellor entered. He looked considerably more composed than he had the previous day, though the effort required to maintain that composure was visible in the rigid set of his shoulders. He noticed Miss Marple at once. For a brief instant he hesitated, as if considering whether to leave immediately. Instead he approached her table. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. I wondered if I might sit for a moment." "Of course." He pulled out the chair opposite her, though Mabel Crewe quickly found a reason to move elsewhere so that she could continue listening without appearing to do so. Richard rested his hands on the table. "I understand you spoke with the inspector yesterday." "Yes." "And you mentioned the man who came to the tea gathering." "I did." Richard nodded slowly, as though confirming something to himself. "That man was looking for my uncle." "Yes, I recognized him." Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "I thought you might." Richard leaned forward slightly. "His name is Thomas Ridley." Miss Marple repeated the name softly. "Ridley. He used to work with my uncle in the diplomatic service." "I see. He came from London yesterday. He said he had something important to discuss with Sir Alister." Miss Marple studied the young man carefully. "And did he explain what it was about?" Richard hesitated. No, but you must have asked. I did. And he told me it was confidential. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People who say that rarely expect to be believed. Richard gave a tired laugh. No, I suppose they don't. For a moment he stared down at the table before speaking again. I didn't like the look of him. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Why not? There was something urgent about him, almost desperate. And yet your uncle agreed to meet him. Yes. Did you hear them speak afterward? No. Richard shook his head quickly. I went to bed. Miss Marple resumed knitting slowly. That must have been quite a shock when you heard the shot. Richard's eyes flickered. Yes. And you didn't leave the house? No. The answer came so firmly that Miss Marple looked up. There was a pause. Then she said mildly, That is interesting. Richard frowned slightly. Why? Because, Miss Marple said gently, someone did leave the house. He stared at her. What do you mean? Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. Footsteps, she explained, just after the shot. Richard's face tightened. You heard them? Yes. He sat back slowly. Perhaps one of the servants. Perhaps, Miss Marple glanced toward the door. Or perhaps someone who wished to see what had happened. Richard said nothing. After a moment he stood abruptly. I should return to the hall, he said. Of course. He left quickly, his pace almost hurried. Miss Marple watched him disappear down the street. A few minutes later Inspector Halliday appeared at the doorway. He removed his hat and joined her table. You spoke with Mr. Mellor, he observed. Yes. And? Miss Marple considered her answer. He told me the name of the man who came to see Sir Alistair. Inspector Halliday's attention sharpened immediately. Ridley, he said. You know him? Yes, the inspector replied quietly. We located him this morning. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Oh? Inspector Halliday met her eyes. He is missing. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. That complicates matters, she said. Yes. The inspector looked toward the road leading out of the village. Very much. Miss Marple lifted her knitting again. But not impossibly, she said softly. Inspector Halliday studied her. You think Mr. Ridley is important? My dear Inspector, Miss Marple replied, men do not travel from London to arrange midnight meetings with retired diplomats unless something quite serious is involved. And you believe Sir Alistair knew what that was? Oh, yes. Inspector Halliday leaned back slightly. And what do you think happened in the garden? Miss Marple's needles paused briefly before moving again. I think, she said thoughtfully, that someone else knew about that meeting too. The inspector's expression darkened slightly, and that someone, he said quietly, did not wish the conversation to take place. Miss Marple smiled gently. That would be my guess. The disappearance of Thomas Ridley created a fresh wave of speculation throughout Little Verran, and by the next morning the entire village seemed to vibrate with restless curiosity. People who had previously been content to discuss Sir Alistair's mysterious death now had an additional puzzle to occupy them. If Ridley had come from London to meet the diplomat and had then vanished immediately afterward, the matter could hardly remain a simple village tragedy. Inspector Halliday had returned to Ferran Hall early, where the atmosphere inside the house had grown noticeably strained. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, speaking in lowered voices, and Lady Celia Wren had retreated to her study, refusing all visitors except the inspector himself. Richard Mellor, however, had not confined himself indoors. He walked across the garden shortly before noon, his steps restless and uneven. The sunlight glinted faintly on the damp grass, and the path near the side gate, the place where Sir Alistair had died, looked deceptively ordinary now. The constable's rope had been removed, though the memory of the crime lingered heavily in the still air. Richard paused there only briefly before continuing along the narrow lane that ran beside the old rectory wall. Miss Marple was already there. She sat on a low wooden bench placed conveniently beneath a hawthorn tree, her knitting basket resting beside her feet. It was precisely the sort of peaceful village scene one might expect on such a morning, except that her eyes were quietly studying the ivy-covered wall where Agnes Lark had claimed the midnight conversation took place. Richard slowed when he noticed her. "Good morning again," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Miller." He glanced toward the wall and then back to her. "You seem very fond of this particular spot." "It is surprisingly interesting," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Interesting?" "Yes, conversations held beside walls often are." Richard gave a short laugh that sounded somewhat forced. "You think my uncle met Ridley here?" "It would appear so." He folded his arms, staring at the ivy. "Well, if Ridley killed him, I hope the police find him soon." Miss Marple continued knitting. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "That would certainly be convenient." Richard frowned. Convenient? Murders are always simpler when the culprit obligingly disappears. He looked at her sharply. "You don't think Ridley did it?" "My dear young man," she said gently. "I think very little, until I understand people properly." Richard seemed about to respond when footsteps approached along the lane. Inspector Halliday appeared a moment later, carrying a small leather notebook. His expression was thoughtful but composed. "Mr. Miller," he said, "just the person I hoped to see." Richard straightened slightly. "Yes, we have received confirmation from London regarding Thomas Ridley." Richard's jaw tightened. "And he left the city yesterday afternoon, as you mentioned." "Then he must be the man who—" Inspector Halliday raised a hand quietly. "There is more." Richard fell silent. "Ridley was not simply a former colleague of Sir Alistair's," the inspector continued. "He had recently been making inquiries about a diplomatic document that disappeared nearly 20 years ago." Richard stared at him. "A document?" "Yes." Miss Marple's knitting paused again. Inspector Halliday continued slowly. "The matter was never made public. However, the missing document concerned negotiations that took place during Sir Alistair's early career abroad." Richard looked puzzled. "What does that have to do with his death now?" "That," said the inspector, "is precisely what Mr. Ridley came to discuss." There was a long pause. Miss Marple finally spoke. "Secrets from the past have a curious way of resurfacing." Inspector Halliday nodded slightly. "Ridley believed Sir Alistair knew what happened to that document. And did he? We cannot yet say." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "This is absurd. My uncle retired years ago." "Yes," said the inspector quietly. "Yet Ridley travelled from London specifically to confront him." Miss Marple watched Richard closely. "Did your uncle ever speak to you about his diplomatic work?" she asked. "Hardly at all." "That is very typical," Miss Marple said softly. "People who keep secrets professionally often continue the habit afterward." Inspector Halliday looked toward the rectory wall. "We believe Ridley arrived in the village shortly before the tea gathering," he said. He spoke briefly with Sir Alistair inside the Crown Tea Rooms. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He seemed quite determined. Afterward he disappeared." Richard exhaled slowly. "So either he killed my uncle and fled, or someone else did." Inspector Halliday studied him carefully. "That is one possibility." Miss Marple returned her attention to the ivy. "What interests me most," she said gently, "is the timing." "Timing?" Richard asked. "Yes, Mr. Ridley arrived unexpectedly. A private meeting is arranged for midnight. Then someone else appears in the garden." Inspector Halliday looked at her thoughtfully. "You believe there were 3 people present." "I believe," Miss Marple said calmly, "that there may have been more than one person with a reason to stop that conversation from happening." Richard shifted uneasily. "And who would that be?" Miss Marple's knitting resumed. "Oh," she said lightly, "someone who was very anxious about what Mr. Ridley might reveal." Inspector Halliday's gaze moved from the quiet garden to the path leading back toward Ferron Hall. "If Ridley discovered the truth about that missing document," he said slowly, "it might have ruined someone." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." Richard looked between them. "But Ridley himself has vanished." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "Yes," she said, "and when people vanish so conveniently," her needles clicked softly together, "one must always ask whether they truly left at all." By late afternoon, the sky had grown heavy again, though no rain had yet fallen. The quiet fields surrounding Little Ferron seemed unusually still, as though the entire countryside were holding its breath. Word of Inspector Halliday's discovery about the missing diplomatic document had begun circulating through the village, though, as was often the case, the story had already been reshaped by imagination before reaching most listeners. In the Crown Inn, Colonel Harbury was once again delivering his opinion with confident authority. "I said from the beginning that it must involve government affairs," he declared. "These things have a way of returning years later. Espionage never truly disappears." Dr. Colwyn listened with polite skepticism. "Perhaps," he said, "though we still have no sign of this Ridley fellow." "No sign at all?" Mrs. Finch asked anxiously. "None," the doctor replied. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual place, her knitting resting momentarily in her lap as she stirred her tea. The room hummed with speculation, yet she seemed interested less in the theories themselves than in the tone of those who repeated them. People often betrayed more by their reactions than by their statements. A moment later, the door opened and Inspector Halliday entered again. This time, his presence created a sharper silence than before. He spoke briefly with the innkeeper before turning toward the room. "I'm afraid I must trouble you all with a question," he said calmly. "Has anyone seen Mr. Richard Mellor this afternoon?" The room exchanged uneasy glances. "No," said Colonel Harbury slowly. "Not since morning." Inspector Halliday nodded. "Thank you." He left again almost immediately. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose quietly. Outside, the air had cooled and a faint wind stirred the hedges along the narrow lane leading toward Ferron Hall. She walked slowly, pausing now and then as if admiring the countryside. Yet her path took her once again toward the old rectory wall. The ivy there rustled softly. Someone was already standing near the wall, Agnes Lark. The girl looked startled when she saw Miss Marple approaching. "Oh, Miss Marple." "My dear Agnes," Miss Marple said kindly, "you seem worried." Agnes clasped her hands nervously. "I can't stop thinking about that voice I heard the other night. Memory often improves with time," Miss Marple said gently. "I keep hearing it in my head," Agnes continued. "The way he spoke." And Agnes hesitated. "I think I know who it was." Miss Marple waited patiently. "I believe it was Mr. Ridley." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "That would make sense. Yes, but that isn't the strange part." "Oh?" Agnes lowered her voice. "When I heard the inspector asking about Mr. Miller just now, it reminded me of something else." Miss Marple's eyes remained calm. "Wes, the man by the wall, he didn't arrive alone." Miss Marple's knitting basket rested quietly against the bench. "You are quite sure?" "Yes," Agnes said nervously. "I didn't see the second person clearly at first, but when the lantern moved, there was someone standing a little farther back." Miss Marple's gaze shifted slowly toward the path leading to Ferron Hall. "And this second person," Agnes swallowed. I think it was Mr. Mellor." There was a long pause. Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "That is very interesting. I didn't realize it at the time," Agnes said quickly. "But when the inspector mentioned his name earlier, it suddenly seemed obvious." "Memory can be like that," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Agnes looked frightened. "Do you think Mr. Mellor killed Sir Alistair?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "My dear child," she said gently, "things are rarely quite so simple." At that moment, footsteps approached along the lane. Inspector Halliday appeared once more, his expression more serious than Miss Marple had yet seen. "Miss Marple," he said. "Inspector, I was hoping to speak with you." Miss Marple nodded politely. Agnes quickly slipped away toward the house. The inspector watched her go before speaking again. "We have just searched the lower gardens," he said quietly. "Yes, we found something in the old boathouse by the river." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And what was that?" Inspector Halliday met her eyes. "The body of Thomas Ridley." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "I see. He had been shot," the inspector continued. "Likely not long after Sir Alistair was killed." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "So Mr. Ridley never left the village at all?" "No." Inspector Halliday's gaze hardened slightly. which means someone here killed 2 men that night. Miss Marple looked toward the distant line of trees beyond the fields. "Yes," she said softly. Inspector Halliday studied her. "You suspected that already." "I suspected," Miss Marple replied gently, "that the meeting in the garden did not end the way anyone expected." The inspector exhaled slowly. "And Mr. Mellor is missing." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That is unfortunate." "Unfortunate," the inspector repeated. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. Her knitting needles clicked together again as she resumed her work. "Because when people run away," she added calmly, "they often make themselves appear far more guilty than they truly are." The discovery of Thomas Ridley's body transformed the atmosphere in Little Ferron from uneasy curiosity into something far darker. Until that moment, the villagers had been able to think of Sir Alistair Wren's death as a shocking but isolated crime. Now it was impossible to ignore the fact that 2 men had been killed in the same night within the quiet boundaries of their peaceful community. By the following morning, the village felt strangely subdued. Conversations took place in lowered voices, and people glanced nervously along the lanes as though the murderer might still be walking somewhere nearby. Inspector Halliday had taken control of Ferron Hall almost entirely. Constables moved quietly through the gardens, and the old boathouse by the river had been sealed off while the doctor conducted his examination. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat once again in the Crown tea rooms with her knitting. Though she appeared calm as ever, her mind had been unusually busy since hearing the inspector's news. 2 men dead, a midnight meeting, and a secret from 20 years earlier. It was a pattern, she thought, but not yet a complete one. The door opened suddenly and Inspector Halliday entered with an expression that suggested he had not slept much. He spotted Miss Marple immediately and approached her table. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." He sat down across from her. "We've learned something more about Ridley." "Oh?" "He had been investigating that missing diplomatic document for several months." Miss Marple nodded. "And he believed Sir Alistair had taken it." "Yes." "Did he?" The inspector hesitated slightly. "That seems increasingly likely." Miss Marple resumed knitting slowly. "And the document concerned negotiations abroad, I believe." "Yes." The inspector lowered his voice. "If it had been revealed at the time, it would have caused a serious political scandal." Miss Marple glanced up. "How unfortunate." "Indeed." Inspector Halliday leaned forward. "We think Ridley confronted Sir Alistair with evidence and arranged the midnight meeting." "Exactly." Miss Marple considered that quietly. "And Mr. Mellor?" The inspector sighed. "He is still missing." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then she spoke very softly. "I do not think he left the village." Inspector Halliday studied her. "You're quite certain?" "Yes." "Why?" Miss Marple looked toward the window where sunlight fell across the empty street. "Because," she said gently, "running away requires preparation. And you believe Mr. Mellor had none?" "Quite." The inspector nodded slowly. "That is a reasonable observation." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "There is something else that interests me." "What?" "The order of events that night." Inspector Halliday waited. "Ridley meets Sir Alistair in the garden. They speak beside the rectory wall." "Yes." "Then someone else appears. That would be Mr. Mellor." "Possibly," Miss Marple said. Inspector Halliday frowned slightly. "Possibly, yes." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. "Consider the situation carefully, Inspector. Ridley arrives from London carrying dangerous information about Sir Alistair's past. He insists on a private meeting." "Yes." "And yet Ridley himself ends up dead as well. That suggests someone else wanted him silenced." "Precisely." Inspector Halliday watched her intently. "You believe a third person was present?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe the garden was much more crowded than anyone realized." The inspector considered that for a moment. "We did find something unusual in the boathouse," he said slowly. "Oh, a second lantern." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "How interesting." "Yes." Inspector Halliday opened his notebook. "It means someone else went down to the river after the shooting." Miss Marple nodded. "To dispose of the second body." "Exactly." They sat quietly for a moment. Then Miss Marple spoke again. "There is something else I should mention." Inspector Halliday looked up. "Agnes Lark told me she heard part of the conversation between Sir Alistair and Ridley." The inspector's attention sharpened immediately. "What did they say?" "She heard Ridley say, 'You know why I'm here.'" Inspector Halliday nodded slowly, and Sir Alistair replied, "Not here." The inspector leaned back. "That suggests Sir Alistair feared being overheard." "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And he was correct." Inspector Halliday looked puzzled. "You mean Mr. Mellor overheard them?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No." "Then who?" "Then who?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the distant road leading out of the village. "Someone who had known about that missing document for many years." Inspector Halliday stared at her. "You think the killer is someone older?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "Older, perhaps, but more importantly, her knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm. Someone who had far more to lose from Ridley's discovery than Sir Alistair himself." Inspector Halliday's expression darkened as the meaning slowly settled in. "You believe Sir Alistair wasn't the only one involved in that scandal?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "No, Inspector." Outside, the wind stirred the branches along the empty lane. "I believe," she said quietly, "that Sir Alistair had a partner." The following evening settled over Little Ferron with a stillness that seemed almost deliberate. The sky had darkened into a deep autumn blue, and the first stars had begun to appear above the church tower. Lamps glowed softly in cottage windows, and the narrow lanes were unusually quiet, as though the village itself sensed that the long tension of the past days was nearing its end. Inspector Halliday had arranged for several people to gather that evening in the drawing-room of Ferron Hall. The room, usually reserved for formal visitors, felt strangely intimate now. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Lady Celia Wren sat upright near the mantel, her composure as controlled as ever, though the faint tightening of her hands revealed the strain beneath her calm. Colonel Harbury and Dr. Colwyn occupied chairs near the windows, both visibly curious about the inspector's request. Agnes Lark remained near the doorway, uncertain and nervous. Miss Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair, her knitting folded neatly in her lap for once. Inspector Halliday stood near the center of the room. "Thank you all for coming," he said calmly. "I believe we are now close to understanding what happened on the night Sir Alistair Wren was killed." The room fell into attentive silence. "As you know," he continued, "Sir Alistair arranged a midnight meeting with a man named Thomas Ridley. Ridley had recently discovered information regarding a diplomatic document that disappeared 20 years ago." Colonel Harbury shifted slightly. "Yes, you mentioned that." Inspector Halliday nodded. "Ridley believed Sir Alistair had taken that document during negotiations abroad." Lady Celia's gaze hardened slightly. "My brother served his country with distinction." "That may be so," the inspector replied quietly. "But Ridley appears to have uncovered evidence suggesting otherwise." Miss Marple spoke gently from her chair. "Sir Alistair had an opportunity during those negotiations that might have been tempting." Lady Celia did not look at her. Inspector Halliday continued. "Ridley travelled from London to confront Sir Alistair and recover the document. And instead he was murdered," said Dr. Colwyn. "Yes." Inspector Halliday paused, but Sir Alistair was killed first. The listeners exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Ridley arrived expecting a confession," she said softly. "Instead, he encountered something quite different." Inspector Halliday nodded. "Ridley and Sir Alistair met beside the rectory wall. They began discussing the document." Agnes shifted nervously at the doorway. That's when someone else approached. Inspector Halliday's eyes moved slowly across the room. Someone who had been listening. Colonel Harbury frowned. "You mean Mr. Mellor?" "No," said the inspector. A silence fell. Miss Marple looked toward Lady Celia Wren. "It was rather unfortunate," she said gently, "that Mr. Ridley chose such a quiet village for his investigation. In a place like this, secrets rarely remain hidden forever." Lady Celia's expression remained composed, but her voice grew colder. "What are you implying?" Inspector Halliday spoke quietly. Ridley had discovered that Sir Alistair did not act alone 20 years ago. The room grew very still. Miss Marple continued softly. The missing diplomatic document was extremely valuable enough that two people might decide to keep it. Lady Celia's eyes narrowed slightly. You cannot possibly suggest, but Ridley had learned the truth, Miss Marple said calmly. He knew the document had been taken by Sir Alistair and protected ever since by someone close to him. Inspector Halliday stepped forward slightly. Ridley confronted Sir Alistair in the garden, but before Sir Alistair could explain everything, someone else intervened. Miss Marple looked steadily at Lady Celia. Someone who realized that Ridley's discovery would destroy far more than Sir Alistair's reputation. Lady Celia rose slowly from her chair. This is absurd. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. You were listening near the rectory wall that night. When Ridley threatened to expose the truth, you shot your brother before he could reveal your involvement. A stunned silence filled the room. Colonel Harbury stared in disbelief. My dear lady, surely. Inspector Halliday spoke quietly. Ridley saw what happened. That is why he ran toward the river. Miss Marple nodded. You followed him. Lady Celia's composure finally cracked. You have no proof. Inspector Halliday opened his notebook. The second lantern found in the boathouse belonged to you. Your initials were engraved beneath the handle. Lady Celia's face had gone pale. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Ridley knew the truth, and so you killed him as well. For several seconds, Lady Celia said nothing. Then she laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. My brother was weak, she said coldly. He intended to confess everything. After 20 years. Inspector Halliday watched her carefully. And you could not allow that. No. The single word hung in the air like a final verdict. Miss Marple lowered her gaze briefly. Secrets, she said quietly, can be very dangerous companions. Lady Celia stood motionless as the inspector stepped forward. The fire crackled softly in the silence of the room. Outside, the night wind moved gently through the trees of Little Ferron, carrying away the last fragile illusion that the village had ever truly been peaceful. Morning came slowly to Little Ferron after the long night at Ferron Hall. A thin mist drifted across the fields beyond the village, and the hedges along the lanes were still silver with dew. It was the sort of quiet morning that seemed determined to restore ordinary life, though the events of the previous evening lingered in everyone's thoughts like the fading echo of a storm. Word of Lady Celia Wren's arrest had spread before breakfast, though the telling of it varied greatly depending on who was speaking. Some insisted she had confessed calmly. Others claimed she had raged violently. The truth, as it often did, lay somewhere in between. Inspector Halliday had taken her into custody shortly after her admission in the drawing-room, and by midnight she had been driven away to the county station. The village awoke to a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. At the Crown Tea Rooms, the morning customers gathered once again around small tables, speaking quietly but with unmistakable fascination. I would never have believed it, Mrs. Dalton murmured. Nor I, said Colonel Harbury. A most remarkable woman. Dr. Colwyn stirred his tea thoughtfully. Remarkable perhaps, but also desperate. Mabel Crewe leaned forward eagerly. Imagine living with such a secret for 20 years. Miss Marple sat near the window as she had done every morning during her visit. Her knitting moved gently in her hands while the conversation flowed around her. It was fear, she said quietly. Several heads turned toward her. Fear? Repeated Colonel Harbury. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Secrets become heavier the longer one carries them. Eventually, they begin to shape a person's entire life. Dr. Colwyn nodded slowly. She believed exposure would destroy everything. Exactly. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a moment. Sir Alistair had grown tired of the burden. She continued softly. When Ridley arrived with proof of the missing document, he realized the matter could not remain hidden forever. And Lady Celia could not allow that, the Colonel said. Miss Marple gave a small nod. She had spent 20 years preserving that secret. To lose it suddenly would have meant losing the life she had built around it. Dr. Colwyn leaned back in his chair. So she killed her own brother. Yes, and Ridley. Miss Marple resumed knitting. Ridley was unfortunate enough to witness the first crime. For a moment the table fell silent. Outside the window the village green looked almost unchanged. A few children were crossing toward the schoolhouse, and a milk cart rattled slowly along the lane. The normal rhythms of Little Ferron had begun to return. Inspector Halliday entered the tea-room shortly afterward. His face showed the tired satisfaction of a man who had finally completed a difficult task. He spotted Miss Marple and approached her table. "I thought I might find you here, Inspector." He removed his hat and sat down. "I wanted to thank you." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "My dear Inspector, I did very little. You noticed what others overlooked." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is often easier in villages." Inspector Halliday rested his hands on the table. "When you first suggested Sir Alistair might have had a partner in the scandal, I confess I was skeptical." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Diplomatic secrets rarely involve only one person." That turned out to be quite true. Inspector Halliday looked toward the window. The missing document was eventually sold to a foreign intermediary. Sir Alistair arranged the transfer, but Lady Celia managed the money afterward. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, that explains why she feared exposure more than he did." The inspector studied her thoughtfully. "What first made you suspect her?" Miss Marple paused before answering. "It was the conversation Agnes overheard. The one by the rectory wall." "Yes." Inspector Halliday leaned forward slightly. "You mean when Ridley said, 'You know why I'm here'?" Miss Marple nodded. Sir Alistair's reply was very telling. "Not here," the inspector recalled. "Exactly." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "He was afraid of being overheard. That suggested someone nearby already knew about the secret. Inspector Halliday considered that. And Lady Celia lived in the house." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "She would naturally be curious about any midnight meeting in the garden." The inspector nodded slowly. "You realized she must have been listening." Miss Marple smiled. "And once one understands people, the rest becomes quite simple." Inspector Halliday rose after a moment. "Well, Miss Marple, the village owes you a debt." Miss Marple shook her head modestly. "Oh dear, no. Villages have always managed their troubles long before I came along." The inspector laughed quietly and departed. Miss Marple finished her tea and gathered her knitting basket. As she stepped outside, the sun had risen fully above the rooftops of Little Ferron. The air felt lighter now. Yet as she walked slowly along the lane, she reflected, as she often did, on the curious nature of human behavior. People were capable of kindness, loyalty, and great generosity, but they were also capable of astonishing deception when fear or ambition entered the heart, and secrets, she thought, were perhaps the most dangerous things of all. They rarely stayed buried. Miss Marple paused briefly near the old rectory wall before continuing on toward the quiet village street. Behind her, Little Ferron was already returning to its ordinary routines. But like every village she had ever known, it would never again look quite as innocent as it once had.